In recent months, an unsettling pattern has begun to take shape across Russia, one that few dare to speak about openly. It's a story that doesn't begin on the front lines, but in quiet towns, small villages, and dimly lit courtrooms where justice appears more symbolic than real. Beneath the surface of official reports and patriotic broadcasts lies a deeply troubling reality. A surge of violence committed not by criminals or strangers, but by men in uniform, by those who were once called defenders of the homeland. And what's perhaps most disturbing, many of them will never see a real prison cell. Since the beginning of mobilization, Russia's military courts have received more than 1,000 cases involving murder or fatal beatings. 1,000 crimes, 1,000 shattered lives. These are not isolated acts of rage. They form a consistent, grim statistic that shows how war, when brought home, tears through the fragile fabric of civilian life. Each story begins differently. A drunken argument, a misunderstanding, a wounded ego, but ends the same way, with death. What unites them is the fact that, more often than not, punishment never follows. Instead of prison sentences, the convicted are sent back to the front, their crimes left hanging in bureaucratic limbo. Behind every such case, there's someone still waiting for justice. A brother, a sister, a widow who keeps writing letters, hoping someone, somewhere, will answer.
One of those people is Mikhail Otroshko, a former police officer who spent 25 years serving the law. Today, he finds himself fighting the very system he once trusted. His brother Oleg was killed during an argument in a small cafe in the Kuban region. Not by a criminal, but by a Marine named Sergei Podobet. The entire incident was captured on video. A quarrel, a punch, a man collapsing, his head striking the pavement. Oleg died within minutes. But when the case reached court, the accused wasn't imprisoned. He was simply sent back to serve, the court reclassifying the murder as negligence. For the victim's family, this wasn't justice, it was betrayal. Stories like this are no longer exceptions. They've become an unspoken rule. According to data analyzed by Mediazona, over 1,000 criminal cases involving killings or severe injuries leading to death have passed through military courts since the mobilization began. Yet behind those numbers lies something more profound: the quiet erasure of accountability. Murder cases are closed mid-trial with vague notes like, "The accused cannot participate in proceedings though his location is known." The translation of this bureaucratic code is simple: the accused has been sent to war. The process stops, but the system records it as resolved. The statistics are chilling, but the silence surrounding them is even more alarming. Some courts refuse to publish any information about defendants who participated in the war, claiming they are protecting personal data. Others limit their reports to such a degree that even journalists can't tell whether the accused were ever convicted. In civilian courts, things look different. At least there, sentences sometimes lead to imprisonment. But in military tribunals, justice often ends where the front line begins. And this, perhaps, is the central paradox of today's Russia. The law is written, procedures are followed, but in the end, the result remains predetermined. There is always a form, but rarely a consequence. Yet behind every case file stands a real human being. Someone who has lost a father, a brother, or a child. Someone still demanding an answer that never comes. Before we go further, don't forget to support independent journalism. Subscribe, like, and share this video, because stories like these are precisely what many would prefer you never hear. These are not just statistics. These are people. Their pain buried under phrases like classified, pending, or service continuation. But what happens when soldiers who've seen the battlefield bring that same violence home? What happens when justice turns its back? Stay with us. The next part will uncover the full picture. Part 2. The deeper one looks into these stories, the clearer it becomes that what is happening is not an accident, but a pattern. One that stretches from local police stations to high military courts and reaches even into the Ministry of Defense itself.
The machinery of justice, once designed to protect civilians and uphold order, has been repurposed into a mechanism of avoidance, allowing those who commit the most brutal crimes to simply disappear behind the front line. There is no clear boundary anymore between soldier and suspect, between defender and killer. And every week, new cases emerge from distant regions. Krasnodar, Vladimir, Belgorod, Nizhny Novgorod, all telling the same story. Crimes committed, trials opened, sentences replaced by deployment orders. Take the case of Valery Shumilov, a man from a small village in Vladimir Oblast. He was once a farmer, a husband, and a father. When mobilization began, he saw in it both a chance to escape poverty and an obligation to serve. Within weeks, he was wounded, sent home, and changed beyond recognition. The war had left its mark, the sleeplessness, the restlessness, the aggression that surfaced after every drink. In March of 2023, after a 2-day binge, a dispute broke out between Shumilov and a neighbor over the war itself. One man insisted that there was no real war, that everything was propaganda. The other, Shumilov, shouted that he had seen it with his own eyes. The argument ended with 3 knife blows. The victim died before the ambulance arrived. Shumilov was sentenced to 9 years of strict regime imprisonment, yet before he ever reached the colony, he was transferred back to the army. His ex-wife received no compensation, only silence. 10 months later, he disappeared at the front. Officially, he is missing in action. In reality, he is one of hundreds of convicted killers still wearing a uniform. There is the case of Sergei Tyulenev from Lyubertsy, who beat a disabled man to death in Volgograd after the victim proposed a toast to paratroopers. Tyulenev, a contracted soldier, took offense, struck the man repeatedly with a wooden plank, and left him unrecognizable. The court sentenced him to 10 years and ordered compensation to the victim's daughter, yet even this symbolic justice never materialized. Months later, the bailiffs informed the family that the convict was once again serving in the armed forces. The payments were frozen, the case paused. And in January 2025, the same man, wounded and decorated, appeared again, not in a prison cell, but on the front, where he had been re-enlisted. The circle closed itself. A killer became a soldier became a hero, and justice turned into paperwork. Another tragic name, Pavel Kukin, a man from the city of Vyazniki, killed in a bar fight by Sergeant Pavel Savchenkov. The argument began over the special military operation, a debate, a misunderstanding, a rush of anger. Kukin bled to death on the floor, while Savchenkov, intoxicated and furious, was detained and briefly jailed. The court recognized the murder, but decided the soldier's service and family circumstances mitigated the crime. The sentence was reduced, and within months, Savchenkov was free. By February 2024, he had registered a new phone number and was spotted alive and unpunished in Vladimir Oblast. The relatives of the victim, exhausted and disillusioned, refused further interviews. They had learned what many others already knew. There is no point in fighting a system that equates violence with valor. The deeper journalists from Mediazona dug, the more they uncovered. A network of cases where soldiers convicted of murder were granted freedom in exchange for service. In one instance, a 41-year-old father of 5, Vitaly Vozamiller, killed a man during a drunken brawl, repeatedly stomping on his chest. He was sentenced to 9 years in a strict regime colony, yet within months he was again in uniform. His son, unable to contact him, posted online, "My father went on a mission in January and has not been heard from since." What this means in practice is clear. Death on the battlefield has replaced prison as the ultimate punishment. The Russian legal system now functions as a revolving door between the courtroom and the front. Judges quietly write verdicts that sound firm but carry little consequence. Restriction of service, temporary reassignment, deduction of salary. These phrases substitute what should have been prison sentences. And behind this linguistic camouflage lies a simple truth. War has rewritten the moral code. A man who kills another man is not always a criminal anymore, especially if he wears a uniform and fights under a flag. Even when families try to appeal, the walls of silence grow higher. Complaints to investigators, prosecutors, even to Alexander Bastrykin, the head of Russia's investigative committee, go unanswered. When victims' relatives speak to the press, they face hostility or indifference. "You don't understand," one official reportedly told a grieving brother. "He's a soldier. He's needed at the front." Needed, as though the battlefield were a sanctuary for those who should have been behind bars. Some of these cases are so gruesome that even experienced investigators struggle to describe them. In one, a decorated officer, Grigory Bavykin, beat a pensioner to death near a military base in occupied Luhansk. The victim had criticized Russia's invasion. Bavykin not only assaulted him, but desecrated the body in a way too cruel to detail. The court acknowledged the brutality, but cited the soldier's outstanding service record and the provocative behavior of the victim as mitigating factors. The result? 7 years in prison, never served.
Bavykin too was later seen back in uniform, his name appearing in military rosters months after sentencing. This judicial leniency is not limited to one region or one command. Across Russia, from Sevastopol to Rostov, from Penza to Novosibirsk, military courts are making similar decisions. One soldier, Alexei Nagvakin, shot a woman in Crimea after she criticized the special military operation. Another, Denis Chernyshov from Samara, beat a man to death after accusing him of insulting the army. Both were sentenced to long terms. Both were later redeployed. The pattern repeats with chilling precision: murder, trial, sentence, redeployment, disappearance. A cycle that erases accountability and normalizes violence. What emerges from these stories is not only a collapse of justice, but a transformation of morality itself. War has become both shield and justification. The same uniform that once symbolized duty now serves as immunity. Crimes once unthinkable are now described as excesses, mistakes, or acts committed under stress. And the line between the battlefield and civilian life is fading fast. The killers return home, changed, broken, unable to live without violence, and the country around them grows accustomed to their presence. If you've been watching until now, take a moment to support this work. Share it, comment, and subscribe, because what you're hearing is the kind of truth that doesn't make it into state television. These are stories of people left alone in the ruins of law and empathy. Stories that remind us that when a society excuses violence, it invites it to stay. In the next part, we will go even deeper, into the aftermath, into what happens when the very concept of punishment dissolves, and when killing becomes not a crime, but a profession. Stay with us. Part 3. As this shadow system continues to expand, the consequences ripple far beyond the courtrooms and the war zones. The return of armed men who have learned to see life and death as routine is already reshaping Russian society. Violence, once confined to distant front lines, is seeping back into the streets, homes, and towns of the country. What used to be isolated incidents have become a new normal, a quiet epidemic of brutality that no one dares to confront openly. Each case reflects a deeper moral fracture, a point at which the value of human life is measured against the usefulness of a soldier's body in war. And more often, the verdict favors the war. In many of these stories, the families of victims are left with nothing. No justice, no compensation, no closure. When the accused is redeployed, court-ordered payments stop immediately, and the state takes no responsibility. It becomes a bureaucratic void. The case is technically closed, but the suffering continues. This is how Yevgenia Gorelova learned that her father's killer, Sergeant Tyulenev, had not only avoided prison, but was seeking to clear his record entirely. The same prosecutors who once argued his guilt now quietly supported his request. He had been wounded in service, received disability status, and was preparing to be recognized as a rehabilitated man. For Yevgenia, this was the final insult, the realization that her father's death had been officially erased from consequence. What we are witnessing is not only a legal failure, but a transformation of state ideology. The rhetoric of war has created a new moral hierarchy. Loyalty to the army outweighs the sanctity of civilian life. Judges who once prided themselves on impartiality now write verdicts that double as patriotic manifestos. They praise the courage and devotion of convicted men even as they describe the brutality of their crimes. In some rulings, the victims themselves are portrayed as provocateurs, accused of immoral behavior or disrespect toward the special military operation. The result is chilling: a reversal of justice where the dead are blamed and the killers are forgiven in the name of service. This phenomenon stretches from the smallest garrison courts to the upper echelons of the military judiciary. In case after case, the same justifications appear: stress, trauma, moral pressure, provocation. The law has become elastic, bending to accommodate the needs of the army. Military prosecutors often coordinate directly with defense lawyers to reclassify charges from intentional murder to negligent harm. Some trials end abruptly when the accused cannot attend due to military duties, and proceedings are quietly suspended. Months later, the same names resurface on lists of combat casualties. The war has become both weapon and sanctuary, turning accountability into a casualty of its own. Journalists who investigate these stories face increasing pressure. Access to military court databases is limited. Information is scrubbed, redacted, or withheld. Requests for comment are ignored, and the rare officials who speak off the record admit that it's better not to touch such topics. Yet despite the barriers, independent outlets like Mediazona persist, analyzing thousands of verdicts, tracing digital footprints, connecting names and cases the system would rather keep buried. Their work reveals the anatomy of impunity, a structure that not only tolerates violence, but recycles it, feeding the war with men already conditioned by it. Each new conflict zone becomes an open door for those escaping punishment. A convict doesn't need a pardon, he only needs a uniform. Once at the front, he becomes untouchable. Commanders report his deployment to the court, and the case is either paused or erased from record. The court files end with vague lines such as "participates in special operations" or "temporarily unavailable for detention." In legal language, that means immunity. In human terms, it means the cycle continues. Families who once waited for sentencing now wait for death notices instead. Consider the fate of Nikolai Butubayev and Alexander Takalov, two contract soldiers from Rostov region. Convicted for beating a man to death after an argument about the war, they received relatively light sentences, 5 and 4 years respectively. One remained behind bars at his wife's request. The other chose to return to the front. Months later, he vanished. His wife, now raising 2 children alone, refuses to discuss the case. "What's the point?" she says. "There's no justice left." Her words echo across hundreds of similar stories, people who have stopped believing that punishment exists at all. The state's quiet tolerance of these outcomes sends a clear message. Service cleanses sin. Killing becomes acceptable, even forgivable, as long as it's done by someone in uniform. This philosophy seeps into public consciousness, shaping how communities perceive violence. In small towns, returning soldiers are often feared but never confronted. Neighbors whisper, but no one reports. The uniform protects them. And for many of these men, the violence doesn't stop. It simply relocates, from the battlefield to the kitchen, the bar, the street. The war's brutality follows them home like a shadow that won't let go. At the same time, Russian propaganda continues to glorify the military as the embodiment of national pride. The same system that excuses murder in uniform calls these men heroes and defenders. Their photos appear in patriotic exhibitions, their names inscribed on walls of honor,
even as court records quietly document their crimes. It's a parallel reality, one of medals and funerals, flags and silence. And in this silence, the boundaries between heroism and horror blur completely. The moral cost of this transformation will outlast the war itself. A generation of men has learned that violence brings not punishment, but purpose. They will return home, wounded, celebrated, and utterly unrestrained. The institutions meant to contain them, courts, police, local governments, have already surrendered. What remains is fear. Ordinary citizens know that to challenge a soldier, even a convicted one, is to risk everything. The message is clear. In today's Russia, the law belongs to those who fight, not to those who fall. But beyond fear, there is still resistance. Quiet, determined, fragile. Journalists, lawyers, and families continue to collect evidence, to write, to speak. They know the risks. Their voices are small compared to the machinery of propaganda, but they persist because truth, however fragile, still matters. They document the crimes not only to expose the killers, but to preserve the memory of the dead. Every name, every case, every file they publish is an act of defiance against the erasure of reality. As this investigation closes, one thought remains clear. War doesn't just destroy bodies, it corrodes the very idea of justice. When killing becomes routine, when courts turn into staging grounds for excuses, a country